Donald Trump was in the middle of defending his immigration policy when he suddenly turned his sights on the UK and said, "Deport the Royal Guard too." Most people laughed, but one man didn't. A Royal Guard, seated quietly in uniform, stood up. And when he finally responded, he asked just one question. If we're deporting those who stand still to honour sacrifice, should we start at Arlington? The room went silent. Trump's smile vanished. And for the first time that day, he didn't have a comeback. Before we show you what went down, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Let's get into it. The Marble Conference Hall in Washington, D.C. was exactly the kind of place where powerful people go to feel even more powerful. Flags everywhere, cameras positioned at every angle, and enough gold trim to make a casino jealous. The event was called The Future of Western Power, which sounds impressive until you realize it was basically just an excuse for world leaders to give the same speeches they'd been giving for decades. Trump was the final keynote speaker, and if you've ever watched him work a room, you know exactly what that meant. No teleprompter, no filter, just him, a microphone, and whatever popped into his head. He strutted up to that podium like he owned the place, adjusted his signature red tie and scanned the packed auditorium with that familiar grin that said, "I'm about to say something that'll get me on every news channel by dinner." "You know," he started, voice carrying easily without the microphone, "they asked me to talk about defending the West. Well, let me ask you something. What are we even defending anymore?" You could feel the shift in the room. The European delegates stiffened. A few people in the American section leaned forward. Trump was just getting warmed up. "We spend billions on defense. Billions. And some of our allies are out there wasting money, protecting guys who just stand still. Statues in fuzzy hats. You've seen them." He paused, letting that sink in, that smirk getting wider. "Royal Guards, that's what they call them. I say, deport them. Or better yet, put them in storage next to the Wax Museum. Save the taxpayers a fortune." The American crowd burst into laughter. Not the good kind, the nervous, performative kind, where people laugh because they think they're supposed to. Most of the Europeans didn't even crack a smile. But there was one person in that room who had a very different reaction. Seated in the back row, slightly apart from the main British delegation, was a man in full ceremonial uniform. Scarlet tunic with brass buttons that caught the light, black trousers with a crease so sharp it could cut glass, and the kind of posture that looked like it had been carved from stone. Lance Sergeant Tobias Hart didn't blink, didn't shift in his seat, didn't even breathe differently. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, while Trump continued his routine. Something about that stillness was unsettling. Not the stillness of someone who'd been insulted and didn't know how to respond. The stillness of someone who was listening very carefully and making calculations. The camera operator must have felt it too, because the shot lingered on Hart for just a moment longer than it should have. Long enough for people watching at home to notice the scar running along his left temple. Long enough to see the way his hands rested precisely on his knees, not relaxed but controlled. Long enough to realize this wasn't just some ceremonial decoration they'd wheeled out for the cameras. Trump finished his remarks to polite applause, but the energy in the room had changed. People were stealing glances toward the back row, toward the man in red who hadn't moved a muscle. As the session ended and delegates began filing out for the lunch break, Hart remained seated. Same position, same expression, same perfect stillness. Because tucked inside his dress tunic, pressed against the lining near his heart, was a document that had been waiting 2 years to be used. Today might finally be the day. During the lunch break, word spread quickly through the diplomatic corridors. Trump's "Deport the Royal Guard" comment was already making rounds on social media. Aides were fielding calls from news outlets. The British delegation huddled in a private room discussing damage control. But Hart wasn't part of those conversations. He stood alone in a side corridor, looking out through tall windows at the Washington skyline. A few people passed by, other diplomats, security personnel, staff members. None approached him. There was something about his presence that suggested he wasn't there for small talk. A young British aide, maybe 25 and eager to prove himself, finally worked up the courage to approach. "Sergeant Hart, I'm Davies from the embassy. Just wanted to check if you need anything for the afternoon session." Hart turned slightly. "I'm fine, thank you." "Right, well, If you need anything at all... Davies hesitated, then lowered his voice. That was quite something this morning. Trump's comments, I mean. Bit much, wasn't it? Hart's expression didn't change. Politicians say things. Still, you must have thoughts about it, being in the Guards and all. For a moment, Hart studied the young man's face. Then he spoke, voice quiet but clear. I think, he said slowly, that actions matter more than words. Davies waited for more, but Hart had already turned back to the window. The rain was coming down hard at Wellington Barracks that night, turning the windows into rivers of distorted light. Inside the mess hall, the usual evening routine felt different, heavier. The television in the corner was tuned to BBC News, volume low, but everyone knew what was playing. Trump mocks Royal Guard during live summit. The chyron scrolled across the bottom of the screen, while a political analyst droned on about diplomatic tensions and ceremonial traditions. Most of the guards were trying to laugh it off. Dark humour is military currency, after all. Well, lads, said a young Coldstream guard, barely old enough to shave properly, pack your bags, straight to the deportation queue. Someone else muttered something about wax museums. A few snickers rippled through the room. But Lance Sergeant Tobias Hart wasn't laughing. He sat alone at a corner table, nursing a cup of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. Late 30s, compact build, with the kind of weathered calm that comes from years of standing in storms without complaint. There was something about the way he held himself. Not stiff, but controlled, like every movement was deliberate. The mess hall gradually quieted as people noticed Hart's silence. It wasn't unusual. He'd never been much of a talker, but tonight felt different. Corporal Finch, seated across the room, finally broke the tension. Sarge, you all right over there? Hart looked up slowly, those grey eyes taking in the room. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he finished the last sip of his cold tea, set the cup down with the same precision he did everything else, and stood. Just need some air, he said quietly. Won't be long. As he headed for the door, another voice called out. Sarge? It was Thompson, an older guard who'd served in Iraq. For what it's worth, some of us have been places where standing still took more courage than moving. Hart paused at the doorway, hand on the frame. He didn't turn around, but his voice carried clearly. I know. The corridor outside smelled like leather polish and old wood. Portraits of former guards lined the walls, men from the Falklands, Iraq, Afghanistan. All in dress uniform, all with the same quiet dignity Hart carried now. He walked past them without stopping, turned into a side hallway, and entered his quarters. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a career soldier. Small, immaculate, organised down to the last detail. Every surface bore the kind of military precision that becomes second nature after decades of service. Hart reached under his narrow bunk and pulled out a locked case. Inside, wrapped in protective plastic, was a document folder bearing two insignias: the crest of the UK Ministry of Defence and a discreet US liaison stamp. He'd been given this folder 2 years ago during a meeting in Whitehall that officially never happened. Most people didn't even know the programme existed. Operational Protocol 17B, he read aloud, voice steady in the empty room. In the event that ceremonial military tradition of the United Kingdom is publicly insulted by a foreign political figure during an international forum, the attached service member is cleared to issue verbal response. The authorization was co-signed by Joint Military Liaison Command, both UK and US sides. It had never been used. Not in Brussels, when that French minister made his joke about toy soldiers. Not in Ottawa, when the Canadian PM suggested ceremonial guards were expensive nostalgia. Hart had always hoped it would stay that way. But as he folded the document carefully and slid it into the inner lining of his dress tunic, he knew tomorrow would be different. The second day of the summit was scheduled to be routine. Closing remarks, photo opportunities, diplomatic handshakes, nothing controversial. But Trump had other plans. 2 years earlier, on a grey London morning that felt like every other grey London morning, Hart had received an unusual summons. Not unusual because of what it said, just a time and an address in Whitehall. Unusual because it came with no explanation, no context, and no signature. The letter had arrived 3 days after a particularly difficult incident. A group of American tourists had spent an hour taunting Hart during his shift at Buckingham Palace, calling him useless and a waste of taxpayer money. One had even tried to make him flinch by pretending to throw something at his face. Hart had stood perfectly still, as trained, while their guide laughed along. That night, he'd gone home to his small flat in Pimlico and stared at the photo on his mantelpiece. His brother Michael, in marine dress blues, taken just before his deployment to Afghanistan. The same brother who'd written him letters about the honour of service, about standing for something bigger than yourself. Michael had died 3 weeks later when his convoy hit an IED outside Kabul. The building was one of those anonymous government offices that blend into the London landscape. No signs, no brass plaques, just a narrow door with a buzzer and a man in civilian clothes waiting inside. "Lance Sergeant Hart," the man said. It wasn't a question. Hart nodded. "Follow me." They walked through corridors that could have been in any office building in the world. Beige carpet, fluorescent lights, the faint hum of air conditioning. The only clue this was something official was the complete absence of windows. The conference room was small, functional, forgettable. A woman in a navy suit sat at the far end of a table that had seen better decades. She gestured for Hart to sit. "Thank you for coming," she said, voice crisp and professional. "This isn't disciplinary. You're here because someone upstairs flagged your file." "Which part?" Hart asked. The man who'd escorted him smirked. "The part where you did 2 tours in Helmand, came home, and requested ceremonial duty for life." Hart's expression didn't change. "I like the quiet." The woman leaned forward. "The program we're about to discuss exists because of incidents like last week. When foreign dignitaries or officials publicly mock our ceremonial forces, it creates diplomatic tensions. But if we respond officially, it appears we're being overly sensitive about tradition." She paused, studying Hart's face. "However, if one of our own, someone who's actually served, who understands both the ceremony and the sacrifice, chooses to respond in the moment, that's different. That's authentic." The woman pushed a sealed folder across the table. "You've been selected for a liaison program. It's not public. Most of Parliament doesn't know it exists. We partner with select allies to place military representatives at high-level summits." "Decoration," Hart said flatly. "Symbols," the woman corrected sharply. "There's a difference." The man continued. "You'd attend international conferences as part of Britain's delegation. No speaking role, no public engagement. Unless a specific clause is triggered." He lifted a document from the folder. "In the event of public insult directed at the Royal Guard during a live international forum, you're authorised to respond. Once. No rehearsal, no approval needed in the moment. Pre-cleared by both governments." Hart studied the paper. The language was precise, the seals genuine. "You're not expected to use it," the woman added quickly. "We'd prefer you didn't." "Then why give it to me?" The man leaned forward. "Because in rooms full of noise, it matters who breaks the silence." Hart considered this, then nodded once. "I'll take it, on one condition." The woman raised an eyebrow. "If I speak, no edits, no spin, no one tells me afterward how I should have said it differently." A brief exchange of glances between the two officials. "Agreed," the woman said, "but only if the clause is clearly triggered." Hart stood, took the folder, and headed for the door. As he reached for the handle, the man called after him. "Most people would have asked more questions." Hart paused, but didn't turn around. "I didn't agree to answer questions," he said quietly. "I agreed to be ready." Walking out into the London drizzle, Hart had hoped the moment would never come. But now, 2 years later, with Trump's voice still echoing in his memory, he knew it had. The morning of the second day brought unexpected tension. Hart arrived at the venue early, as always, and took his assigned seat in the back row. The hall was less crowded than the day before. Many delegates had already returned to their home countries. But the cameras were still there, and more importantly, so was Trump. During the pre-session mingling, Hart overheard fragments of conversation. American staffers joking about British theatre, European diplomats discussing diplomatic incidents, British officials using phrases like "unfortunate choice of words" and "moving forward." Nobody was talking to Hart directly, but he could feel eyes on him, the quiet man in the red uniform who'd become the unofficial target of yesterday's humour. A CNN reporter approached the British delegation during a break, microphone in hand. Any response to President Trump's comments about the Royal Guard? The lead British diplomat, A career civil servant named Sir Geoffrey Whitmore gave a diplomatic non-answer about respecting traditions while focusing on modern challenges. The reporter pressed, "What about the guard himself? Any comment?" Sir Geoffrey glanced briefly toward Hart, who sat perfectly still, hands folded, staring straight ahead. "The ceremonial guard is here in a non-speaking capacity," Sir Geoffrey said carefully. "His role is purely symbolic." The reporter followed his gaze to Hart. "Symbolic of what?" "British military tradition," Sir Geoffrey replied. "Continuity, service." "But surely he has thoughts about being called a statue by a former president." Hart's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, just enough for the reporter to notice. "I'm afraid he's not available for interviews," Sir Geoffrey said quickly, stepping between the reporter and Hart. But the reporter had already seen what he needed to see. The man in the red uniform wasn't just decoration, he was listening to every word. The second day of the summit started quietly enough. The glass-panelled conference hall looked identical to the day before. Same flags, same cameras, same sense of self-importance hanging in the air like expensive cologne. But everyone knew why they were really there. Trump's "Deport the Royal Guard" comment had already become a meme. Political analysts were having a field day. The British delegation looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Hart sat in his assigned seat, same row as the day before, same perfect posture. The only difference was the document now resting against his chest, waiting. The morning sessions were predictably boring. Panel discussions on defence spending, trade agreements, the future of NATO. Standard diplomatic theatre. Then Trump returned to the stage. His handlers had clearly worked on him overnight. The speech was more measured, more presidential. But you can't change a man's nature with a few talking points. "I love our allies," he began, arms spread wide like he was addressing a rally. "But let's be honest, some of you aren't pulling your weight. You send men in funny hats while we're sending F-35s. You guard palaces, we guard the world." Scattered laughter from the American section. A few uncomfortable glances toward the British delegation. Trump was warming up now, feeding off the energy in the room. He'd tasted blood yesterday and wanted more. "I mean, think about it," he continued, gesturing broadly. "We've got real threats out there. China building islands, Russia moving missiles, North Korea launching rockets. And Britain's answer is, what? A guy who can't even move without permission?" More laughter, louder this time. Hart's breathing remained steady, but his eyes had changed. Not angry, something colder than that. The look of a man making final calculations. "And I say this with respect," Trump continued, building to his crescendo. "But if you've got people standing still while the world burns, maybe they ought to move, or move out." The crowd ate it up. Even some of the Europeans were smiling now. Trump couldn't resist the final blow. He pointed directly toward the back row, toward Hart. "I see we've got one of them here today. How about it, soldier? You ready to get a real job?" The laughter was louder now, more confident. Trump was in his element, working the crowd like a seasoned performer. But Hart had heard enough. The moderator stepped forward, clearly hoping to redirect the conversation. "Thank you, Mr. President. At this time, we invite final remarks from attending nations." A chair scraped backward. Hart stood. The sound wasn't loud, but in that moment of transition, it cut through the air like a blade. Every head turned, every camera swiveled. Even Trump squinted across the crowd, trying to process what he was seeing. A royal guard standing indoors at an international summit. The moderator's voice cracked slightly. Yes, the gentleman from the UK delegation." Hart stepped forward slowly, deliberately. No rushed movements, no theatrical gestures, just the measured pace of a man who had made a decision and was seeing it through. He stood at attention, spine straight, face neutral. When he spoke, his voice carried easily through the hall without amplification. "If we're deporting those who stand still to honor sacrifice, should we start at Arlington?" The silence was absolute. Not a cough, not a whisper, not even the sound of someone shifting in their seat. Hart continued, his voice steady as stone. "They stand still too, rain or shine, not for cameras or kings, but because silence is part of their duty. Because sometimes what you don't say means more than what you do." Trump's smile flickered and died. "The men I serve with don't talk much either. We carry stillness like armor. But make no mistake, we've served. We've bled. Some of us buried our brothers with our own hands." The pause was perfect, just long enough for that truth to settle. So if your memory starts where utility ends, then perhaps it's not the guards you've forgotten, but the fallen. A pen dropped somewhere in the press section. Nobody picked it up. Hart gave a slight nod to the moderator, turned, and began walking toward the exit. The silence followed him. Every diplomat, every journalist, every aide watched as he moved through the rows with the same unhurried dignity he'd shown for years of ceremonial duty. He had barely reached the aisle when the interruption came. "Sir, stop right there!" A young American security staffer, all authority and no wisdom, was approaching from the side of the stage. His hand hovered near his radio like he was about to arrest someone. "You're not on the speaking roster. Who authorized you to address the summit?" Hart stopped, turned slightly, and without a word, reached into his dress tunic. The envelope he withdrew was thin, official, sealed with gold wax. He handed it to the staffer, who hesitated before taking it. The young man looked at the seals, then at Hart, then stepped away quickly, muttering into his radio. Within moments, the envelope was in the hands of the summit coordinator, a woman who'd been managing international crises longer than most people had been alive. She opened it carefully, read the top line, then scanned down to the signatures. Her expression changed. She cleared her throat and read aloud. "Per standing authorization signed jointly by the United Kingdom Ministry of Defence and the US Department of Defence, Lance Sergeant Tobias Hart of the Coldstream Guards is permitted to speak at any international forum without prior scheduling if insult is directed toward the Royal Guard or the legacy of British ceremonial military service." She looked toward a US general standing against the wall. He gave a curt nod. "That clearance is legitimate." The young staffer who'd stopped Hart looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "My apologies, sir." Hart acknowledged him with a slight inclination of his head and continued toward the exit. Nobody else tried to stop him. Nobody asked questions. Nobody applauded. They just watched as a man who had chosen silence for years walked out of the most powerful room in the Western world like it meant nothing, because the only thing that had ever mattered had already been said. Backstage, the atmosphere was toxic. Aides moved like they were walking through a minefield, nobody wanting to be the one to tell their boss how badly things had gone sideways. Trump stood near a mirror, face flushed, hands clenched at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Who the hell authorized that?" The junior aide, who drew the short straw, stepped forward, clutching a folder like it might protect him. "Sir, it was a liaison program approved by the UK Ministry of Defence and co-signed by our own diplomatic office, dating back to 2021. It allows ceremonial representatives to respond if national dignity is challenged." Trump whirled on him. "He wasn't even supposed to talk. He hijacked my speech." "Technically, sir, it was pre-authorized." Another aide, this one with more experience reading Trump's moods, stepped forward. "Sir, we should focus on damage control. The video's already circulating. We need to craft a response." Trump's eyes narrowed. "What kind of response?" "Maybe something about respecting our British allies while still maintaining that ceremonial roles need to evolve with modern threats." "Screw that," Trump snapped. "I want everything on that guy. Service record, personal life, vulnerabilities. Find out what makes him tick." The aide looked uncomfortable. "Sir, he's British military. There might be restrictions on what we can access." Trump waved dismissively and began pacing. Behind him, an older advisor, a retired colonel with 30 years of uniform under his belt, watched quietly from the corner. When the room finally quieted, he spoke. "Sir, that man's brother is buried at Arlington." Trump stopped mid-stride. The colonel continued, voice steady. "I looked him up after seeing that clearance. His brother was a Marine, died in Helmand. Tobias Hart carried the casket himself, stood by the grave in full dress uniform, never said a word." The room went silent. "There's more," the colonel continued. "Hart did 2 tours in Afghanistan, came home, requested ceremonial duty. Word is he wanted to honor his brother's memory by standing guard for others." Trump's face was unreadable now. "You can't attack that, sir. Not without looking like you're attacking Gold Star families." On the security monitor, they could see Hart walking down the corridor. Same measured pace, same perfect bearing. A US Marine posted at the exit stepped aside and saluted. Hart didn't acknowledge it. He didn't need to. The embassy car was waiting. Hart got in, the door closed, and the vehicle pulled away into the DC afternoon. No fanfare, no media scrum, just a guard going home. In the holding room, Trump's usual swagger was nowhere to be found. For the first time all day, he had nothing to say. The older advisor broke the silence one last time, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood what they'd just witnessed. That's how dignity wins. Nobody argued. There was nothing left to argue about. Back in the main hall, the summit continued, but the energy had fundamentally shifted. Delegates spoke in lower tones. The American delegation looked subdued. Even the press corps seemed more thoughtful in their questioning. Sir Geoffrey Whitmore, the British diplomat, found himself fielding questions about Hart from colleagues who'd suddenly developed a new respect for ceremonial traditions. "Has he always been that articulate?" asked a German official. "I honestly don't know," Sir Geoffrey admitted. "He's never spoken before, not once." A French delegate shook his head. 25 words, that's all he said, but it changed everything. 26, corrected a journalist who'd been counting, and yes, it did. But it was the reaction from the military representatives that told the real story. A US Air Force colonel who'd been seated near the front approached Sir Geoffrey during the final break. "That guard of yours," he said quietly. "My son's buried at Arlington. Section 60. What he said about standing still." The colonel's voice caught slightly. "My boy would have appreciated that." Similar conversations were happening throughout the hall. A Canadian general mentioned his own country's ceremonial guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. An Australian defence minister spoke about the Anzac Day services, where young soldiers stood for hours honouring the fallen. The CNN reporter who'd tried to interview Hart earlier was now speaking to her producer via earpiece. "No, I'm telling you, this is the story. Not Trump's speech. This. A man who chose silence for years, then spoke once when it mattered." She was right. Within hours, clips of Hart's response would be shared across military social media networks. Veterans organizations would post it with comments like, "This is what service looks like," and finally, "Someone who gets it." In the press section, a veteran journalist from the Times was typing furiously on his laptop. His headline would read, "When silence speaks, the power of choosing your moment." Outside, the car carrying Lance Sergeant Tobias Hart disappeared into traffic, carrying a man who had waited 2 years to speak for 30 seconds. And in those 30 seconds, he'd said everything that needed saying. Should ceremonial guards stay silent when their nation's honour is questioned on foreign soil? And what does it say about our priorities when standing still becomes controversial? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story changed how you think about quiet strength, smash that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Hit the bell so you never miss our daily stories. Share this with someone who thinks ceremony has no place in modern politics. They might see things differently. There's another incredible story waiting for you right now. Click the video on your screen and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that chooses when to speak. Thanks for watching. Remember, not all battles are fought with words. Some are won with silence.